Hello and welcome to the Lockton Marine Podcast. My name is Anders Johannessen, and with me today is Morten Mjaaland, who's the cyber product manager at DNK, the Norske Krigsforsikring for Skip, and my colleague Nic Wilmot, who makes a welcome return to the podcast. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Nice to be.
We are here to talk about cyber risks, more specifically about GPS spoofing or jamming, and how a loss originating with such a risk is treated in standard marine policies. And this is meant to be a companion piece to our episode on GPS spoofing, where we talk about recent threats and happenings. So we will spend very little time on the nature of these events and spend more time on how standard insurances will and maybe how they should respond to them. So whilst the subject is topical, in many ways it feels like it shouldn't be. We are more than 20 years removed from the first cyber exclusion clause. It's 10 years since the first marine cyber buyback appeared, and marine cyber was the topic of choice for every seminar around the globe for a long time. And the insurance industry has a fascinating on-again, off-again relationship with cyber, but yet it feels little has been done to clarify what is actually covered by standard hull machinery in war and what is excluded. And more importantly, what can marine insurance do to provide clients with efficient solutions? So let me start with you, Nic. Having listened to that long introduction, perhaps it was too long. Why do you think that is? Why do you think it is that marine insurance has such a complicated relationship with cyber as a parent?
And I see that you're suggesting that the marine insurance industry has been a little bit, how should I put this without being rude, slow on this thing. And one way of defending the industry is to say, well, you have to take the long view. The plan was started in 1800 and something. So, and the original Lloyd's policy goes back to the 1500s. So we've been doing this for a long time, and 20 years. What is 20 years in that context? So perhaps you're being a bit unfair in expecting us to sort of react more quickly. Now, I wouldn't subscribe to that point of view, because I think that we're in a completely different reality today. Business practices and the way you have to respond to a changing world is completely different today than it was before. And here in Norway, we pride ourselves on being very reactive, because the plan has its own committee that revises the plan at regular intervals. It's now every is it 3 years now or 4 years? Every 4 years. And so that we should be able to react to this kind of problem, perhaps in a better and more comprehensive way than we have done. But remember, as an industry, we don't have a parliament. We don't have a central organization which controls the industry, and perhaps that's a good thing. So I think that it has, you could say, it's taken a long time, but we are making some progress. And I think that that at this precise point in time, I think this is definitely, we've had enough experience now and had enough time to think about things to be able to try and do something a bit more comprehensive than we've achieved so far.
And on that note, we have Morten with us from DNK. What solutions have you been able to put together? I mean, you're for those of our international listeners who don't know DNK, you're a war mutual for Norwegian ship owners, and a very rich one at that. What solutions have you been able to put together for your members as it relates to cyber insurance?
Well, thank you for asking, Anders. And I think, like Nic is saying, we pride ourselves on being reactive in the insurance industry, but I think those who buy insurance, their job is to be proactive. They need to buy insurance before something bad happens, because there's no point buying it after. That's too late. And that's impossible to do if there's no insurance there to buy. So thus our members came to us really because we are a mutual, and they said that buying cyber insurance, that's almost impossible today. You have to buy several different policies to feel like you're covered, and usually there are gaps in between those policies. And what's perhaps even worse is that when something actually happens, who do you call? Because right off the bat, how can you tell if this is a cyber event that's coming from a criminal actor or a state-backed actor, or whether it's affecting only vessels or vessels and offices or only offices?
I'm gonna have to interrupt you there, because as a child of the 80s, there's only one answer to the question who you're gonna call, and that's the Ghostbusters. But I'm sure that's not what that's not what you were getting at, was it?
Not exactly. But the idea is similar, yes. That you sort of make it into a one-stop shop. And so who you gonna call? Well, DNK. And it is something cyber. Because we designed essentially. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Nick.
Yeah, that's interesting. That DNK has developed in the way that it has, and has responded to its members' needs in the way that it has, because it makes sense. And it, in the broader context of marine insurance, the world has become, the number of vessels sailing around the globe is huge, and maritime trade is probably as big as it's bigger than it has, is still growing, and is very big. And yet, paradoxically, there's the need to have a central, let's call it institutional or location that you can call in a maritime emergency. Really, there should. It doesn't make sense that you have, 50 different numbers that you might call depending upon who you're insured with, because the fundamental sort of things that have to be done and the expertise that's required to deal with the maritime casualty as it develops, irrespective of what the cause is now, there's so much expertise that you need to be able to handle that there isn't a place for many different actors. Really, or isn't a need for many different actors to fulfill that role. And I think that in Norway, we have developed, thanks largely to DNK, we have developed an expertise in responding to maritime emergencies that is pretty unique. Yeah, I think that's one of the emerging things. One of the things that's emerging is that we need real expertise, and we need probably a central location to handle maritime casualties when they occur, a sort of first port of a call.
So following up on that point, so that defining a maritime emergency then in the context of what we're talking about today is interesting, isn't it? Because it's not necessarily immediately identifiable as a maritime emergency. It could be an onshore emergency, or it could be a pure technical emergency that doesn't necessarily look like a traditional marine catastrophe. So when you talk about a one-stop shop and a one-stop solution, Morten, what does that look like specifically?
Yes, in very short words, essentially it is that you try to wrap together all of the bundles that you had to buy before, and then make them cover all of the organization. So you take a typical enterprise policy that you would buy in London, and you add some bells and whistles to that, of course, and then you take a crime policy, which you normally also place in London, and then you take what you have in a buyback typically, which you can find here in the Nordics as well, and you bundle that all into one sort of happy package. And the intention is not only that you get sort of all those coverages, but you get them for your entire organization. So meaning your enterprise policy also responds now for vessels. So Thus, you can have business interruption cases, and you can be covered for third-party liability outside of collision liability, and all those kind of things. So you can feel secure and sleep safe at night that your entire organization is covered for essentially almost what's insurable of cyber losses. And there'll always be some niche things that aren't included, but I think that's a good starting point, and then we can work together to figure out how we adjust as the years go.
So how has the DNK succeeded in this? Where, I mean, many others have tried over the years and not been equally successful in putting together a comprehensive package like that.
I think we're very lucky in DNK. We both have a very, very good relationship with our members, because they know us as a mutual and that we've always taken care of them. So they trust us, which is very, very important when you try to buy a new type of insurance. I mean, we're asking now the members to be proactive. A lot of them have had cyber events, so they can be reactive, but most of them haven't. So we're asking them to be proactive, to buy something that you don't know yet if you need, because you haven't had an event where you needed it. We're telling them, trust us, this is an issue, this is a risk, and that your organization will face it someday. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And therefore, we would like to place this insurance or get this insurance in place before that happens. And
can I ask, sorry, Morten, I didn't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, secondly, I think we're also very lucky that we have Norma Cyber. You're already familiar a little bit with it, so I won't speak too much on it, but they are our daughter organization, and they work on Norwegian, or now Nordic, maritime cyber resilience. And almost, not all, but almost all of the members of DNK are Norma Cyber members already. So that means they're already familiar with cyber risk. They're already starting to put a price on it. And that definitely helps when insurance also comes into place.
I think that partly answers the question I have, which is, in the jungle of cyber products and the complications that come with getting an overview of what you need and what you're buying, there's also very involved processes of whether it's surveys, questionnaires. There's a very complicated process in going from acknowledging that you need something and buying it. Does that become easier with your one-stop shop solution, and the fact that you have a daughter company that specializes in cyber risks?
Absolutely. You're really playing this into my hand here, Anders. But yes, it does help a lot, because Norma Cyber, they already know all their members. They're already working with them on cybersecurity. So instead of us having to ask them all the questions, we rather ask Norma, what do you know them? And can you help us assess them? And they always can. And then we also try to do as much as possible from the outside and in, because we don't see any point why we should be asking you questions that we can figure out for ourselves. So it's very threat-driven, which is also another parallel to how war risks work, in the way that we figure out or work currently with threat intelligence on how do threat actors operate, and how can we operate almost as similar as possible to figure out where would you attack and why would you attack, or how would you attack. And those are the kind of angles that we need to figure out before there is an attack.
Thank you.
Yeah, Anders, could I have a comment?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think this is really so interesting, because it just illustrates how the sort of world is changing. And when I was talking about responding to maritime emergencies, I was thinking of any kind of maritime emergency. And when something happens, what you do know is that the vessel has run aground, or there's a fire, or whatever. But at the beginning, it may not be at all clear that that it is in any way related to a cyber issue. So that although you might have a strong suspicion, depending on the circumstances, so that and then you have this issue. Well, who's who owns the casualty on the insurance side? Put it that way. Is it the P&I club, or the Hull and Machinery insurer against non-war perils? Or in a way, what you're saying, Morten, is that it's sort of, in one way, it makes sense that you start. That somebody rings you and says, look, something's happened, and you say, well, let's get working on it. And then if it turns out that it's, say, nothing to do with cyber, what do? Call in the Hull and Machinery insurer or the P&I club, or both.
You're very right, Nick.
But you see, what I'm getting at is that if you're going to look at things like that, what the world needs is a really sophisticated, really 24-hour watch sort of facility that will handle any sort of maritime emergency where there's going to be insurance implications. There has to be somewhere you go to start. And that somewhere has to be really on the ball and really well-resourced and have the necessary expertise to then continue the whole process and involve all the various insurers who might be involved.
And I think that's a very interesting point of departure for the next bit of this discussion. So for those less fortunate than Morten's clients, the ones who have to rely on standard insurances for their losses, if we go back to the beginning of talking about a GPS spoofing or a GPS jamming event, Nic, let's imagine that you have a vessel and they are subjected to some form of attack or some form of event that impairs their ability to use the GPS, and as a consequence they run aground or they collide or they have some sort of physical loss.
Something goes wrong.
If we disregard the exclusion clauses, what is covered by standard insurances in that instance?
I think this is a very important question to map out things properly. So the first thing I have to say is, well, we've got to talk about both the marine policy and the war policy.
Indeed.
And so if we start with the classical standard Hull and Machinery against marine perils, in other words, the plans 2.8, if you're talking in the plan context, then, and there's no exclusions. Well, fortunately, the plan is on an all risks basis. So the plan is going to say, you're covered. Whatever happens, you're covered. And if there's no exclusion, no specific exclusion, then you're covered. So you're covered until there's an exclusion.
Yeah.
But there's one tiny little detail here which I think is worth mentioning. Let's say that it turns out that what happened is that you have your navigation equipment, which can be pretty expensive, has been compromised, and then you have all sorts of consequential losses. You run aground, you get damage to the hull, and so on. But nothing has happened to the navigation equipment other than it's been compromised in terms of its functionality. Now, you could say that since the plan has all risks, it should cover it. But then you say, yes, but has there been physical damage to the vessel? And you see that this is not going to be, that's not an easy answer not an easy question to answer. Because if equipment or systems on board are compromised, and there's a cost involved in restoring them, you could say, well, yes, well, what does physical damage mean? It means it can go down in terms of cracks and so on. It can go down to the molecular level. So you could argue that that somehow at a molecular level, the program is, if you see what I'm getting at, and therefore it's covered. And paradoxically, I think that one of the things that the plan and that marine insurers, hull insurers should be doing which would benefit ship owners, is to make it quite clear that the costs of restoring IT functionality is excluded because it belongs somewhere else. And you need to have, and the sort of product that you, Morten, are selling, that covers precisely that kind of thing. And it's part of a bigger cyber picture, if you like, or as part of a bigger cyber context. So it would make perfect sense, actually, and be beneficial, I think, to all parties, that if the hull insurers excluded the cost of restoring functionality to IT systems. But having said that, the main point which you wanted to bring out was that in the absence of exclusions, then everything is covered.
Anything you'd want to add to that, Morten?
Thank you, Anders. And just to follow up on Nic here, I think spoofing and jamming, it's a very complicated issue because there are quite a few hoops that you're sort of jumping through. Initially, say, if you're taking the MSC Antonia incident where you're grounding following a long-term spoofing, it's firstly grounding. That's generally a hull covered kind of thing. But then you sort of go into the exclusion LMA 5403, where you say that in no case shall this insurance cover loss, damage, liability, or expense directly or indirectly caused by or contributed by, etc. And then you can say that, well, maybe spoofing wasn't the main cause here. Maybe poor seamanship was the main cause that MSC Antonio went to ground. But you can't say that it didn't at least indirectly contribute to this loss.
Sure.
Because it most definitely did. So that's one way for the whole insurers to exclude it. And if it's excluded that way, then typically it goes towards cyber insurers. And for us, it's quite easy, I'd say. That's a typical event to cover. But if you go the other way and you think, all right, well, what's the root cause here, really? Who did this? Because it's definitely a malicious act, sort of, to run a spoofing or a jamming. That's an onshore system that's equipped usually by nation states. And it's usually to fend off air traffic, not necessarily marine traffic. But still, there's definitely a threat actor involved here. And there's no specific reason, at least that I can imagine, why you can't activate also the war exclusion.
As a means for inflicting harm, as the clause says, right?
Yes. And that's, of course, difficult to say. Is it inflicting harm or is it not inflicting harm? When you're talking about spoofing jamming, generally you can say that it's used a lot to defend yourself, but it's also sometimes used to
I'm sorry about
disrupt
that. I don't know what happened.
the operations.
What I find interesting about the exclusion clause is that so the first cyber exclusion clause, this clause 380 that was introduced in 2003, I believe, was one of a few post 9/11 initiatives to safeguard the market against massive aggregation losses. So the cyber exclusion clause, whether it's the old version or the new version, is there to protect the insurers against a cataclysmic loss where there's a huge aggregation of losses. So where there's maybe 50 vessels grounding as a consequence of a spoofing event. I don't think, it certainly shouldn't be the case that any insurer in the marine space wishes to exclude a perfectly legitimate navigational loss because of a GPS spoofing event. It should only be used where they cannot possibly handle the aggregation. But that's a test the market hasn't really gone through yet, because we've only had a very few known examples of single vessel losses, and we certainly haven't had any examples of multi-vessel losses. But that raises a very interesting point. So with your cyber book growing, and you have an audience that adopts your solutions, how do you feel about the aggregation, and how do you solve that?
Oh, that's $1 million question right there. Well, firstly, generally what we see about spoofing and jamming is that it is identifiable. So with Norma, we identify the areas where there is a high threat or a high level of spoofing, jamming every single week. And we publish those reports and we share those with our members, and also now beginning to share it in our digital map. So whenever they go in, they could potentially in the future get a notification that you're now entering an area with high threat of spoofing. And as an insured, I mean, always when you enter an area of high risk, you need to do the proactive measures of averting loss. Otherwise, it is gross negligence. And not looking to exclude anything here, but in general, I think most important thing there is that if you are aware of this happening and you take the necessary precautions, we still view it as highly unlikely that you will end up with a casualty of some sort. What we typically see more of are those that are 100% dependent on their GPS. So if you're talking sort of a subsea operation or seismic operations, those kind of fleets, when they are out, they are 100% dependent on their GPS. They don't work with just radar and looking at sea maps because that's not accurate enough. So there you can see losses right away. Of course, those losses never gets into the paper because there's no physical damage. They don't run aground and they don't have a loss of hire case with the plan because the plan constitutes that you have to have some sort of physical damage to claim loss of hire. So for us, that's very important also that we can cover loss of hire even when there is no physical damage. So those kind of events can be covered. And that's also events where we can see potential systemic risk. For us, very important to map always how many types of vessels do we have in these areas, so we are aware of the situation and not going in blind.
Thank you, Morten. A little bit of a peek behind the curtain here. Nic, you had some tech issues in the middle of your elaboration on the difference between war and marine. So we're going to let you pick that up where you left off. Yes.
And if there are no exclusions, you start out by saying, well, anything that happens is covered unless it's excluded. So when there's physical damage, you look to marine. But then, of course, there could be indications that this is caused, the damage is being caused by a war peril. And historically, war perils started out, of course, with war and everything that entails, and civil war, and the definition of war was sort of written to cover everything you could possibly think of in terms of war and weapons and so forth. But then it became clear that, well, what do you do about, how do you distinguish between war and, say, pirates and terrorists? That's a bit difficult. So why not just include pirates and terrorists in war? There's a kind of, it makes sense in a way. And then you start saying, well, what about people who, for political or religious reasons or carrying out some kind of sabotage or action against a vessel? And then you say, well, yeah, but that's all sort of human, human, the Norwegian expression is faenskap. It's human agency attacking the vessel in some form or another, and therefore let's just include all of that in war. And so that the Institute war clauses now include persons acting maliciously, in other words, with some kind of bad intent. Now there's case law that says that the maliciousness must be addressed, must be against the vessel itself or the owner, but still you've gone a long way from traditional war. And it leaves you with in a cyber context, it leaves you with an issue of, well, how do you know whether this is this somebody acting maliciously? Is a virus is malicious in a sense, and so you get difficulties about what is war and what is marine in the cyber.
Which that makes sense from an insurer's perspective, because they have different risk profiles and the aggregation profile is different between war and marine. But as a client, it's not something you want to concern yourself with. And if someone attacks your vessel or subjects your vessel to GPS spoofing, you don't want coverage to rely on what their intentions were and who they represent. That's something that you want to remove yourself from.
Exactly.
You just want it covered, don't you?
Yeah. And preferably without too much discussion.
Yes, exactly.
And there have been cases where the borderline between war and marine has been quite crucial for the owner's chances of recovery, due to the arrest of vessels and in places like Venezuela and so on. So there have been issues there. And it would be interesting to ask, Morten, how do you handle this? Are you basically saying, well, if it's any form of cyber misfeasance, to use an English word, or misbehavior, then basically it's ours, it's war. Is that how, do you think like that?
That's, again, a difficult question to answer, because, yes, in general, we define a cyber event as a very broad thing, almost like you say, as long as there's any sort of involvement. It could be even system failures, and it could be disgruntled employees coming from internally.
Yeah.
So it's really broad definition, and it's meant to cover all these bases. This is also, however, a cover that comes in secondary to other coverages. So if your hull insurer picks this up, then we will not. If your war coverage picks this up, then we will not. We're there to cover everything that's left. All of these nuances, and like you just talked about, there are so many uncertainties here. And the idea is that this cover covers for all of the uncertainties. And you can sort of sleep well at night, as my boss Irene likes to call this coverage, the sleep well at night coverage.
Okay. Okay.
So let me address something that I find quite interesting. We talked, Morten, about the marine cyber endorsement, the prevailing cyber exclusion that we find in most marine and war policies around the world, where a computer system, malicious code, virus, all of this, if it's used as a means for inflicting harm, the loss is then excluded. And we talked about what means for inflicting harm might represent. But in the context of spoofing, I find it quite interesting that these attacks, if you can call them that, are very often not directed at shipping. They're not directed at ships. They're directed at aircraft or drones or things of that nature. How do you read that? Both of you or any of you, how do you read that in the context of an exclusion? Right? Because the exclusion says as a means for inflicting harm, but it doesn't specify that harm has to be directed towards the ship or a ship or any ship. Just if the intention is harm, how do you read that?
Go ahead, Nic, you start.
Okay. Well, actually, the case I mentioned in the English courts about interpreting the word maliciously in Walker and the Institute war clauses, I think it would be quite reasonable to take the same kind of approach and say that the intention to cause harm, although it doesn't say so specifically, since it's an exclusion, and as a lawyer you could argue that since it's an exclusion and it must be interpreted narrowly, you could say, well, it has to be, the intention must be to cause harm to the vessel, the crew or its cargo, or the ownership of the vessel. And that if it's just something that's out there in a general, intention to cause harm in a general sense, like a virus, then that's not within, that doesn't bring it within war. Or it doesn't bring it within within the terms of the exclusion, so it should be covered.
Very interesting. Yeah, it's a very interesting take. on the other side of that, not to say that I disagree, but you can say, firstly, all right, if it's not war, then it's hull. Well, hull is meant to sort of cover for accidents. And these things are not necessarily accidents. They're not spoofing this area by accident. And this vessel is not entering that area by accident. They're entering into an area where a threat actor is performing an operation to either defend themselves or to disrupt operations of someone else. So in some way you can say that there's someone malicious intent here, definitely. And without concluding that, then as you might have read, both of you, Average Adjusters Association also wrote on this during the summer. And at least the way that I read that, from what I can see, they don't seem like they concluded that hull insurance will pick this up. It seemed a lot more like this would be eligible to exclude under the cyber exclusion LMA 5403. And therefore, at least the way we work, we assume that we will pick up those losses.
But that brings me back to my earlier point that the exclusion clause shouldn't be there to exclude losses that the underwriter wants to exclude. It should only be there to exclude the losses that they absolutely have to exclude because they can't possibly pay for them. But it's a very interesting discussion, because the reality of this particular type of event is that it's going to be incredibly hard to determine that the incident was directly directed, if I may say so, at a ship as a means for inflicting harm. It is most likely to be directed at something else.
I think, Hannes, this brings us to, I think, one of the things that you raised before we met, because what you really want here is you need cover, and Morten, you've emphasized this very clearly, the need for cover for all of these events. And so what we're lacking at the moment is a proper coordination between cyber cover and the traditional marine products. And as I think we've mentioned before when we've talked together on this, there's a fundamental difference between cyber risks and other risks that face maritime operations, in that when you look at a traditional ship owner looking at buying traditional insurance, the marine insurances are by far the largest part of his insurance bill. The non-marine insurances are minimum. And therefore, all the focus is on the marine cover and how it works and so on. But when it comes to cyber, you need to flip that perspective, because in a cyber context, you must start with the enterprise. You must, if you want to have proper cyber protection, insurance protection, you have to look at your whole enterprise and all the things that could go wrong and all the possible, possible losses, which is what you've done in the product that you're now presenting. And so, but in order to deal with cyber adequately, you have to work at a corporate or enterprise level, get that sorted out, and then make sure that the division of labor between traditional old-fashioned marine insurance and your cyber cover is properly managed. And that preferably you should have no gaps and no overlapping, but it's better to have a little bit of an overlap than to have gaps.
Yeah,
definitely.
Which brings me to my next question here. So having discussed this, right, and I think we would all consider ourselves reasonably experienced in this field. Even between us, we find it difficult to clearly state what's covered, what's not covered, what's war, what's not war, which means that, and we also agree that that's a problem that our clients shouldn't be dealing with at all. It should be covered full stop. So for any ship owner concerned about GPS spoofing or jamming or cyber risks in general, how do they start considering what to insure, and let's disregard where to insure it. But where do they start with this?
Well, I'd start by talking to someone who knows these areas of high threat level, spoofing, jamming. There are a lot of professionals out there, of course. I'll always recommend Norma Cyber because we work a lot with them and they are very good at what they do. And start by figuring out which type of areas do you have high level of this and which vessels do you have going through there. Because, of course, you don't have to insure yourself against every risk that's out there. Even if there is a risk that you can get spoofed on the North Pole, you most likely will not. So insure yourself where you need insurance is a simple answer there.
Thoughts, Nic?
No, I think it gets back to what I was saying. I was saying a while back that if you start out by looking at your cyber risks and everything that's involved there, and then sort of at the same time you're thinking, yes, but I've got my traditional marine insurance, which covers damage to the vessel. Basically, what I want my traditional products to do is to cover damage to the vessel and all the consequences of damage to the vessel, or some kind of an accident, or like pollution or escape of oil and so on. Looking at my traditional marine insurance cover, I want my traditional marine insurer to be there when I'm dealing with those kinds of problems, with the physical problems. And that's so that if there's physical damage, I want my marine hull insurer, or I want that kind of expertise. So it's just it's about finding the right division of labor between your enterprise cyber cover and your traditional insurances.
Maybe it could be a good idea if you put sort of a cyber insurer and the war insurer in the same building and they work together.
Well, yeah, and just by coincidence, there's very few places in the world where you have that. But
and I think it's my duty to also state that a good broker actually does a lot of good in this process to bring all of this together. I would like to thank you both for being part of this. I think it's a very interesting topic, and I'm sure we've not seen the end of these types of events or problems, and that there will still be new solutions coming out as we go forward. And I'm excited to follow that development further. To everyone listening, thank you very much, and we hope to welcome you again on a different episode of the Lockton Marine Podcast.